Hi, this is the video for 12th grade English for Monday, October the 12th. So today it was a bit truncated, a bit short, that is, and a lot of it is left up for you to do on your own. The advertising concept we took up last week, we're continuing today, but this time we're looking into advertising when it advertises an entire group of people. And that is very harmful. We are talking about the examples of racism through the noble Indian, vanishing Indian myth, and then myths about slavery. But you could really apply this to any type of judgment that people make about an entire group when they generalize behaviors to include anybody they see as part of something. So advertising, but in a way that's much more propagandistic and it's much more about prejudice. And we're using that to think about what we're going to talk about tomorrow, raising children. How do you raise kids so that they don't really see this advertising, or so that they're really able to develop a critical mind about it and be thoughtful about judgments they make on other people? And that is a little bit more complicated than it might first appear. So that's what we're trying to consider today. Here's the entire day in front of you, and the stem down here, before, after, if children are taught narratives about the world. So, first, morning announcements. And this is why things were a bit truncated. The morning announcements were 13 minutes long. We got through as much as we could quickly and then moved into the announcements. And we lost a lot of students during the announcements. So if you're doing this work asynchronously, I'll whip through it pretty fast and get you to the stem and try to keep it short because your class itself was short. What the week is about, investigations and evidence. How do we know something is true? So indoctrination versus education is kind of where we sped ahead to. I'm going to show you the background. The background is thinking about the myths of indoctrination. So an advertised myth, something that gives us a negative view of a group of people. I'm going to start with the noble savage myth in America, which is that Indians, as Native Americans often prefer to be called, are innocent and noble creatures who have not been corrupted by civilization. So that's a myth out there, an advertisement for this group of people. And you can see a couple of the paintings that were advertised to the people of the colonies in early America to try to depict what is an Indian. Here's an Indian, this noble, unvarnished, untarnished creature who doesn't have to worry about what it means to be in a civilization. What's problematic with that? The problem is the myth sets up a world where the Indian is not fully human, but instead an innocent creature who doesn't know about the complexities of living. It's a well-meaning myth. It's an attempt to advertise an Indian as something noble and pure, but it does so at the disservice of the Indian's humanity. Another myth. Oh, here's another image of the noble savage. So not only that, the noble savage depicted here, problematically, is responsible for lifting the white man up out of his moral ruin. So in this narrative, Indian equals good, innocent, white man equals bad, corrupt. And the Indian is responsible for bringing the white person up to a level of innocence. This is also problematic thinking. This image itself and what it advertises is deeply problematic. First, it continues to deny the Indian his humanity. It sets the white man up as inherently evil, which is also denying the white man his humanity. And it also makes the Indian responsible for the white man's mistakes, which is just not the way that things should be in the world. Individually, you should be responsible for your own mistakes, not the group that opposes you. So this kind of thinking, this advertising of the whole group, the way it's depicted through political cartoons and paintings, is what we're trying to resist in this part of the unit. Here's another myth. This is the vanishing Indian myth, that Indians were destined to be gone, and now they're gone. And as I say it here, they're not gone. Native Americans are still here in America and a really important part of America. And here's the local example we looked at was the Monacan Indians, who their ancestral homeland is in Amherst, Virginia. It has been for 10,000 years. They're still there. It's true that the settling of America diminished their numbers in drastic proportions. It's true that a lot of their life had to change and there's truly a lot of tragedy in that. But to say that they've disappeared is a disservice to the Indians that are here living a full life and honoring their ancestors who live in that ancestral homeland of Amherst, just across 29 from all of us. So the vanishing Indian is a justification for the way that colonists could push further west and take up land that they said is now available because the Indians are gone. And they're not gone. So this advertising, it shows us how the work can be subtle of getting a group to think a certain way about another group. The advertisements are not so blatant as to say, this group is lesser than you. No propaganda does that. It's going to work in these really subtle ways, and that's the subtlety we have to fight. The last example we did not get to, but is really interesting, is this, the Virginia textbook example of the 1950s, where it depicts slavery as a good thing that made slaves happy. Here's my notes about it. Slavery is both created by and creates racism, which is the advertising of a whole group, treating people like objects, like a product, instead of human individuals. I asked some questions in class today. Do we have a stance on slavery in our schools? Do we teach that it's a personal choice? Do we teach that it's morally wrong? What's the difference between that and indoctrination? Is it okay to say, this is wrong, the way that I am saying today? Or should we leave students to define it by their own metrics and to decide for themselves? It's a sort of ephemeral question, and maybe there is a clear answer until you look at this textbook example, published in the 50s and used by school children in the 50s, 60s. This is a world where slavery is very much seen in this positive light. And I'll show you a little bit of that here. Early in Virginia's history, the General Assembly made laws closely controlling the Negroes. However, the laws were not fully enforced. Many slave masters did not like to have the state government meddle in what they considered their private business. They managed their servants according to their own methods. They knew the best way to control their slaves was to win them over. Many Negroes were taught to read and write. Many of them were allowed to meet in groups for preaching, for funerals, and for singing and dancing. They went visiting at night and sometimes owned guns and other weapons. The treatment of Virginia slaves depended upon the character and the common sense of their masters. It cannot be denied that some slaves were treated badly, but most of them were treated with kindness. Public opinion in Virginia frowned upon harsh masters. And it goes on to say, a feeling of strong affection existed between masters and slaves in a majority of Virginia homes. We have 3 examples here, 1 and 2, and then a further 3, a third example, where in each case the master is the voice, talking about how much they loved their servants, as they call them, and gave them as much as they were able. This section ends by saying, these are but 2 examples of the many records of affection which existed between masters and their servants. It should be noted that Virginians referred to the Negroes as servants and not slaves. So first, Negroes is just the term that was used in the 50s. It's not used anymore. It's really outdated. So back to my question, do we have a stance on slavery in our schools? Well, in the 50s, there absolutely was a stance, and there's a stance now. It's just that all of it is communicated pretty subtly. The stance in the 50s was slavery wasn't as bad as people have made it out to be. The slaves were happy, and the masters were happy too. And most times, this was a positive relationship that everybody benefited from. So is that not itself a kind of indoctrination? For us to say now that slavery is wrong is the opposite. How much are you supposed to let children decide this sort of thing on their own? How much should adults pipe up and say, this is what we think? I don't necessarily have answers. These are just the kinds of questions we asked in the chat today, and we tried to figure out what we think and what you think as students. How do you feel about these concepts? And that's all bringing us to this lesson and its climax in an article we read called I Was a Teenage Conspiracy Theorist. So in this article, the writer talks about how as a young kid or as a 14-year-old girl, she was really susceptible to some of the conspiracy theories that she was hearing in her school. And she puts in the tag here, I want to know why wild conspiracism can be so irresistible. There's something really interesting about conspiracy theories to her as a young person. And as she goes on, she realizes, well, it's not just me. It's young people. When I asked my parents to tell them about my awakening as a child conspiracy theorist, my mom called her reaction as something like bemused tolerance, slightly mystified but non-judgmental. It is a parent's prerogative to overestimate her child. The truth is, at 14, I did not yet really understand that teachers could be wrong, or how to separate good information from bad information. What my mom saw as a second-order lesson about the unknowable peculiarity of the human mind, I saw as a much more straightforward one about secret meanings and hidden triangles. I was recently relieved to know this is all pretty typical from a developmental perspective. Kids can be really literal, says Valerie Reyna. Anyone who has tried to have a conversation with a 4-year-old knows that this is true of younger kids, but the phenomenon extends further into adulthood than many people realize. By our teens, Reyna told me, we can parrot facts, sometimes even complex ones, and sometimes really articulately, but we don't yet have the insight or the life experience to understand bottom line meaning. So, we finished this article on our own, and I'll let you do that. It's fascinating stuff. The end point of all of it is that kids, and I'm going to include you, even though you're really young adults at this point, but you're at the end of that childhood spectrum, are more likely to believe the things that they're told. And so adults really need to be careful about what they're saying. But then you, now that you're 18, you get to own some of this as well and decide how you feel about having been taught. Your STEM today is children are taught narratives about the world. You're still doing before-after if statements, so children are taught narratives about the world comes here, before, after, and if. Children are taught narratives about the world, after children are taught narratives about the world, and if children are taught narratives about the world. And that's how you're going to show me the way that you've processed some of this stuff and made it into your own meaning. There it is right there. And that's your lesson for Monday. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.